It's sort of impossible to make this video without getting personal. I put a lot of myself into this game, from streaming it to tournament organization to 176 YouTube videos. And it's weird to think about all that stuff in the extreme past tense. It's been more than 5 years since the game stopped active development, which is almost twice as long as it existed in the first place. After entering maintenance mode in December of 2019, the servers for the Elder Scrolls Legends are finally being taken down on January 30th of 2025, which means if you're watching this video, you can no longer play the game, and that sucks.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Total Biscuit. Let's have a gander at Elder Scrolls Legends. This is from PAX East 2016. I'm using B-reel footage that was recorded on the Twitch broadcast. So unfortunately I had to mute the audio because it's all commentary, which is not exactly helpful.
In April of 2016, a preview of the Elder Scrolls Legends was posted by Total Biscuit. It was generally a positive review. It acknowledged the surface-level similarity to Hearthstone while praising the mechanics and noting it would be tough to accurately judge until he saw monetization. As far as I can tell, this is still the highest viewed video of the game on YouTube that isn't an ad or a retrospective. Extremely petty but purposeful side note on retrospectives. This is the highest viewed one, and it's not that good. I can't blame them too much since they cover a lot of stuff and this isn't exactly a massive game. But while there were a lot of small things I found annoying, this one bugged the ever-loving fuck out of me.
Each combination creates a different unique house featured from the Morrowind lore, like Halal, Tribunal, Daggeth, etc., which would give you a special mechanic, which is kind of basically Hearthstone powers.
You have eyes. This game looks a lot like Hearthstone. But this is the equivalent of saying Hearthstone's hero powers are the same thing as like green in Magic the Gathering having a bunch of big creatures or something. These are just expansion keywords. Like literally Dagoths just says it has big dudes. It's actually kind of nuts that Total Biscuit more thoughtfully and accurately compares the two games in his video based off a few games at PAX and B-roll footage. Honestly, I don't really care about going through some documentary-style history about the game. I'm sure there's someone from the community who would be better at doing that than me. This is going to be more of a personal timeline than anything else. The story of a niche game told through the eyes of one turbo nerd and the other turbo nerds he met along the way. That means I'm going to focus more on explaining why this game was awesome than why it didn't succeed. More on explaining the community and its strengths than assigning blame or speculating. I saw that Total Biscuit video shortly after it released and it looked interesting enough for me to try to get into the beta, which I did. At the time I worked at Target selling phone plans, and if you're thinking to yourself I didn't know Target sold phone plans, then you stumbled upon the reason I had a ton of free time to try the game out while I was at work. And then, after a few weeks or so of trying the game, including diving into the ranked mode, I stopped. Not only because I found another job that wasn't as cosmically boring, but because I wound up in the spot I'm guessing nearly everyone who played the game did. I liked the game, but not enough to keep playing. And here's where I need to explain something, because me complaining about that death of a game video wasn't just because of pettiness. Obviously, at some point I went back to Tessel and got hooked, but that video and the Total Biscuit video highlight the reason things were different the second time around, because between those two attempts, I got into Hearthstone. Alright, so I'll just start. How did you find the game?
I was playing Hearthstone earlier, and what happened was I had to take some time off to do physics in college, and I got behind on free-to-play, and I couldn't play the decks I wanted to play anymore. So I decided to try another card game, and Tessel was one of the ones that I landed on, and it's the one that I stuck with.
I was thinking about that when I was preparing for this, and I can't remember for sure, to be honest. I know that my impetus was that I had discovered Hearthstone after getting out of prison, and it seemed like everybody had several expansions worth of cards, and I had both no money and no cards, and also no hobbies, and was trying desperately to find something to do.
There are certain types of games where getting into one sort of hooks you to the genre forever. MMOs are a prime example of this. Whenever you see someone talk about leaving something like WoW, they're usually talking about the game they're going to play instead. As people naturally look for something to move on to, newer games are forced to meet a higher standard in order to weather the inevitable comparisons. This can naturally create a section of the genre that appeals most frequently to people already hooked on a concept, and looking for something refined enough to keep their attention. This is why Total Biscuit and that Nerd Slayer video are so different. One is coming from the perspective of someone who plays card games a lot and can identify when the mechanics suitably change things up, and the other is coming from someone who only has that surface level understanding. I'm not saying this hardcore section is where a lot of Tessel's player base came from. It isn't. All of the information publicly available suggests the game was far more popular on mobile than anything else, which is an audience that leans casual. But in the case of the more active community, people on Reddit or Twitch or YouTube or Discord, a lot of us came from another card game that we decided to move on from for whatever reason, and that's the case for me.
So yeah, I was just coming off of Soulforge. If anyone knows Soulforge, clever little digital card game, sort of predated most of the other digital card games. And yeah, Tessel was released just as Soulforge was dying. Soulforge had gotten a little less popular, like numbers were declining. They weren't happy with the technical side of things, and so they outsourced it to a new company who rebuilt the client from scratch, and created a whole new UI that people didn't really like the visuals of.
For about a year after I initially tried Tessel, I started to play Hearthstone more and attempted to actually become decent at it. This would lead to the April 2017 expansion Journey to Un'Goro, which is one of my favorite expansions in any card game ever. The meta was fantastic, the new cards were interesting, and it felt like there was a ton of room to experiment. Unfortunately, enjoying the expansion also highlighted two major issues. First was the amount of time required to rank up in Hearthstone. This was when they did much more drastic monthly resets, and making your way to Legend even with a positive win rate took so much time that being reset to square one the next season was incredibly disheartening. The other was the cost. With Un'Goro came a new standard rotation and a whole bunch of cards I had becoming unusable. I didn't have any issues for the first expansion, but I could also see the writing on the wall. I was cleaned out of in-game currency and dust, and with a new expansion few months away, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep up with it without starting to spend, and I didn't enjoy the constant ranking process enough to justify that. So I looked for other stuff. There was a RuneScape card game that was actually pretty good, but even at that point, it was kind of obvious it wasn't going to stick. And then there was Tessel, which had just released on Steam in May of 2017, followed in June by its first pack expansion. It appealed to me for a few reasons. First was how much more generous it seemed to be. You got way more stuff initially than Hearthstone, and combined with the lower amount of cards in the pool, the prospect of keeping up felt a lot more manageable. The second was Twitch drops. While they're extremely common now, Tessel was one of the first games to actually have them back when they were initially being tested out. And as often happens with these sorts of things, the first iteration had massive issues. Namely, the drops were way too generous. There were 3 possible options for drops that you would get around once per day, with even the worst among them, a free legendary card, being extremely valuable. It's really tough to explain the in-game economy enough to convey how nuts this was, but to use a simple reference, I went from basically no collection to full collection over the span of about 2 months without paying, a process that would be literally impossible in something like Hearthstone or MTG Arena even if I played 24 hours a day. While the Twitch drop campaign was probably a net negative for the game, with that generosity likely hitting their revenue and the Twitch section being a mess of inflated numbers and 24/7 drop farm channels, it did get me to check out Twitch for the first time. Lurking in streams for people like CVH, Turquoise Link, and Romanesque was a great way to learn the game, and gave me a strong enough base of knowledge that I ranked to Legend quickly, and at that point, with both of my major hangups with Hearthstone being answered, I'd become addicted.
I guess the easiest answer why I continued playing it is I found that I was pretty good at it. I picked it up the first month, and although it wasn't actually that big of a feat at the time, I remember getting into the top 100 in that first month felt really good, even though it's very easy to do as long as you just kind of try and play a reasonable deck. We all know that now, but when you first pick up the game and you quickly get into Legend, you're like, oh man, I'm really good at this game.
Looking for more ways to engage with the game led to me playing in tournaments for the first time in any video game, really. I made the finals out of pure dumb luck in the first one I ever played in, before coming up against a very strong player named Atro in the finals and getting obliterated. I would play in more and more as time went on whenever they lined up with my work schedule, and eventually in one tournament I came up against one of the people whose streams had helped me learn. I faced Turquoise Link, and again through pure dumb luck I managed to win. In a weird way, this is what led me to start streaming. What part of the game mechanically did you enjoy?
The most interesting mechanic probably remains the fact that you could swap lanes. Like the fact that there's 2 lanes and then you can also move your characters in between. That single mechanic, I feel like, is probably like the coolest thing that made it so different to other card games.
Mechanically, the 2-lane system is also fantastic. It's really, I felt like when I won, it had something to do with me being smart, which was a nice sort of like reward loop to get involved in.
We're gonna pause that story here to do what I probably should have done at the start, which is explain the game mechanically and why it was so good. Tessel is a relatively simple card game. You have an escalating mana resource that starts at 1 and ends at 12, and you alternate turns with your opponent using this resource to play cards. You have creatures that fight each other, actions that do one-off effects like dealing damage or killing a creature, items which you equip to creatures to raise stats, and supports which do a lot of different things that aren't worth trying to explain. There are 3 major differences between this game and a lot of other card games. Let's start with the most important and the most obvious. The game board is divided into 2. The left lane works as you might expect with no modifiers, but the right lane, called the shadow lane, will grant a keyword called cover, which prevents any creature played there from being targeted by enemy creatures for 1 turn after it's played. This single aspect represents the most important and most interesting mechanic in the entire game, and this is far and away the #1 reason I enjoyed it. Let's do an extremely simple demonstration of this. The very core of the game is about controlling field lane. This might seem counterintuitive if you haven't played it, since the idea of every creature being untargetable on its first turn sounds like a huge benefit, but I'll explain. Let's say I have a creature with 2 attack and 3 health, which I'll shorten to a 2/3. I also have a 3/2 creature to play, and my opponent has a 2/2. The 2/2 and the 3/2 will trade with each other, but the 2/3 will survive with 1 health remaining. If I play the 2/3 into the field lane, my opponent can no longer play the 2/2 there, as it allows me to kill it without losing my own card. In this instance, they either need to simply not play it or play in the shadow lane. This allows me to freely play the 3/2 alongside it, and the opponent needs to draw something else in order to do anything about my creatures in field lane. In this scenario, I have the opportunity to respond to their creatures in shadow, but they have no way to respond to my creatures in field. Now let's rewind and play that creature into the shadow lane. In this scenario, my opponent is free to play the 2/2 into the field lane, which will then block my ability to play the 3/2 there, forcing it into the shadow lane. You might think that this is the same result, with me having both creatures in one lane and my opponent having one in the other, but there's a key difference here. Now any creature my opponent plays in the shadow lane will have its choice of attacks. Since their creatures will now gain cover, they're free to play any creature with higher stats in the shadow lane, and I can't do anything to either trick the combat or use multiple creatures to answer one. Unless I manage to do something to retake the field lane, my opponent now has trade priority over me for the rest of the game, and can essentially value trade every single card that I play. This back and forth between protecting your creatures while denying the opponent good trades forms the fundamental backbone of the entire game, and turns even the most basic uninteresting cards into options that can have a bunch of permutations based on what you expect that the opponent has.
The part of Tesla I love compared to other card games is that your play compared to your other opponent's play for the turn, so the card you play on your turn versus the card your opponent played on their turn, how those 2 cards interact really matters. Like, it defines the game, it defines the pace. Does your card beat their card? Does their card have to run away? For example, Hive Defender is not a very good card. Hive Defender is a contender for the best card in the game, but Hive Defender is not a very good card. 4 mana 3/6 with no real ability. But what Hive Defender does is, if my turn 3 play doesn't beat my opponent's turn 3 play, it doesn't matter, because Hive Defender will protect my turn 3 play and beat their turn 3 play. And so then their turn 4 play has to be able to overcome Hive Defender, and it creates interaction from there.
I'm a huge fan of the prophecy system. I think it's neat. In retrospect, every time that I got pissed off on it, what it really just was telling me was this is really well designed, because it was exciting, memorable, made for great viewing. Whether I'm watching or playing, that aha moment when it happens and the whole game shifts on its head, I thought was really cool. And as a comeback mechanic, I think it's really neat as well.
The second big unique mechanic is the rune system. This is essentially a built-in comeback mechanic to try and offset the inherent snowball nature of a lot of creature-based card games. When you lose 5 health, a rune will break and you'll draw a card. This happens once per game at each threshold, 25, 20, 15, 10, and 5. This gives extra card to the player who's behind and gives them avenues to flip the board. Additionally, if the card you draw from the rune has the prophecy keyword, you'll be able to play it immediately for free, even if it's your opponent's turn. There are no traditional counterspells or quick play cards. The prophecy system is the only real way to do this. This one I'm more mixed on, but I think it's ultimately positive. On the bad side, it adds a lot of randomness to the game, and losing to a prophecy feels bad, especially when the deck you're facing doesn't run a lot of them. On the other hand, it adds a layer of skill to your attacking decisions. You gain a lot of benefit by positioning buffs and attacks to leave your opponent at 1 health above a rune break threshold, and it can affect whether or not you want to trade or attack the opponent directly. In longer control matchups, you also need to balance putting pressure on your opponent versus potentially giving them outs to create an impossible board state. It also encourages aggro to be more thoughtful than a lot of other card games by adding more decision points. Interestingly enough, I think the rune system shows its value far more in the times where runes aren't breaking than when they are.
I love making decks, and Elder Scrolls Legends really just gave you a lot of opportunity. Like, the size of the decks might have had something to do with that, but you just had so much freedom to just keep building. And you can make really bad decks like Spoder Town and be like, and it's just the funniest stuff because it's so bad. And then you run into the guy that you giga counter and they get so mad.
I liked the idea of being able to take these kind of like structural like packs of cards out of like red or whatever and mesh them with the different colors and seeing how those things interact with each other. You know, you could take that like Mighty Ally, you know, red whatever set that used to be popular back then and just match it with all the different colors and see what supports it best and kind of tinker around with that.
The final big mechanic comes in the deck building phase. Tessel occupies a space somewhere between Hearthstone's more rigid class mechanics and Magic's total freedom. Rather than single classes or characters to choose, you can combine 2 and later 3 colors with all the cards from those colors being available, as well as a small amount of multicolor cards which are usually stronger and establish the identity of the color combination. An example of this is the green-purple combination, whose dual color cards consist of ramp, cycle, and big defensive tools, leaning that class towards playing slower control styles. The deck building in this game is fantastic, having just enough restrictions to force tough decisions and enough freedom to allow for experimentation. Workshopping ideas and having one randomly work, then refining it more and more is an amazing feeling, and the balance between that freedom and that restriction hits notes that no other card game I've ever played really has. I'm sure there's games with similar systems. I know Legends of Runeterra is one, but neither that nor anything else felt anywhere as close to as refined as Tessel did. Tessel is simply a mechanical masterclass, one that people who've played other card games will appreciate even more. It has genuinely made it hard for me to play other ones. So why did you continue playing it after that point?
So that one's easy for me. Obviously, I got into streaming a little bit, and I just loved the streaming culture and Twitch culture around the game. I would be frequenting your stream, frequenting Turquoise Link stream, streaming my own. You know, we used to host each other. It was just like a really good, strong community that was built up. Obviously, tournaments too. I mean, that's part of the culture as well, and that kind of fit hand in hand, I guess, with the streaming culture as well, because we would all be in, you know, Warp Meta streams and stuff like that. And yeah, it was always the streaming and the tournaments for me, 100%.
After facing Turquoise Link in that tournament, I went to his stream VOD and watched back our match. It was tremendously interesting, with people in chat commenting on my various misplays and correctly identifying me as a bad player. I was extremely inexperienced at the time and did a lot of things wrong, so the criticism was actually really cool to see. Afterwards, I went into the still live stream and talked about it. This is when I felt like I really joined the community. Previously, I'd mostly just lurked in streams passively absorbing information, but I started talking more and actively participating after this point. At the time, I was in school studying film, learning how to use equipment and learning editing. I thought streaming would be a good opportunity to test some of the things I was learning, so I bought a shitty $30 XLR mic, a cheap mixer and a webcam, and I went live. Content creation is a weird thing in that no matter how much effort you put in, a lot of it is just going to come down to luck. Algorithms and timing can mean as much as consistency and quality, and so I fully recognize that the biggest reason I ended up streaming and gaining some semblance of a following is because of luck. Because the first time I ever went live, Turquoise Link was wrapping up. He recognized my name from that tournament and hosted me for around 700 viewers. That initial stream was some of the most fun I've ever had. Going back and forth with people about a game I just really started to understand, trying things based on feedback. It was surreal to have that many people watching you. Like you're playing a game over a friend's house, but instead of 2 or 3 people, it's several hundred. I streamed the game for the next 2 years. I got partnered, built something resembling a community, and became one of the higher viewed channels in the category. I also started posting YouTube videos, eventually starting a consistent upload schedule and getting decent viewership on a channel that I couldn't get monetized due to a glitch on YouTube's end. I don't say this as if it should mean anything to you. I'm proud of the work I put in and what I accomplished on Twitch, but in the end, we were all small fish in a small pond. The real importance was how it pushed me into wanting to be a part of the community and wanting to help build it. When you put so much time into something, it's natural to get invested. And so it didn't really become about spending time streaming. It was about hanging out in other streams, becoming known and knowing people. What aspects of the community stood out to you?
Basically everybody in the top 100 would always be going around and trying to like figure out what like a new good deck would be, and I kind of haven't noticed that in many other games, maybe because the game ended up being relatively small, but I always felt like people were always trying to figure out together what was going on.
I've mentioned before, like when I actually met people in person, World Championships, it could feel a little awkward because I've insulted basically everyone in the Tesla community at some point on multiple occasions. So there are Like, there are some people I'm sure just don't like me, that I'm an ass. My wife started out with that impression of me. Yeah, I'm still impressed that I still have a number of friends in the community despite that. So everyone was keen to be friends. Everyone wanted to be part of the community.
PvP games breed toxic communities. It's kind of unavoidable. Someone's success means someone else's failure, and no one likes to fail. I don't play League of Legends, but I've heard horror stories. I do play Call of Duty, and I can't even record footage for this brief mention because half the usernames would probably get me demonetized. But I think things are naturally different for niche games. There's a collective desire to want success for the game, because you feel like you've found something that other people don't appreciate. It fosters a less toxic atmosphere. It naturally leads to more friendliness because we're all in it together. We all chose the same sinking ship. There's an element of familiarity that doesn't happen with bigger games. You face the same names every day, you get to know people you've barely exchanged words with. That situation that happened with Link randomly hosting me on my first stream because he recognized my name, that's not just a one-off thing. There would be plenty of times you'd see streamers gain followings nearly instantly because they'd be recognized from constant ladder matchups or other people's chats. Making new decks and figuring out new metas was a collaborative effort rather than a race to the top. The lower player count meant that the higher reaches of the ladder were accessible to people who normally wouldn't have the time or inclination to grind. This wasn't a pure positive. It would occasionally be frustrating to try and approach the game from a try-hard perspective, because of the random decks you'd face even on high ladder. But it was overall a good thing for the game. It was inclusive to a lot of different types of players in a genre where more playstyles would usually get frozen out. Listen, I don't want to do the thing where I say this community was something that was one of a kind. I'm sure there's more like it. I'm sure there's been more than one time where a game existed that was niche but still big enough to be worth putting time into. But that doesn't mean it wasn't an important experience for a lot of people. Gaming as a hobby is extremely broad, and the idea of me picking one game and getting so into it that it became a big part of my life might sound completely absurd, but this game fostered that in me. There's a reason I made the comparison to MMOs, because I've heard similar stories for those. People made lifelong friends here, people met and got married here. The game really only existed for 3 years, but I put a lot into those 3 years. I co-ran an organization that ran community tournaments just because I wanted to give people a place for competition. Hours of my time every week, just trying to create something for the niche within the niche. There were other volunteers too. People who would wake up at ungodly hours because they were in some random time zone I'd never heard of, just to admin tournaments or cast games. All of this is to say the game was so good that it felt worth it. We didn't randomly choose to spend this much time or get this invested. It was a result of a truly special game both in mechanics and accessibility. This many people caring about it is not an accident or an anomaly. The game was really fucking good. The original developer of the game was Direwolf Digital, maker of another online CCG called Eternal, as well as some really sick board games. It would work on it from the initial closed beta launch in April 2016 through to May of 2018. Here, an odd thing happened. It was announced that Direwolf would be moving off the project, with development being handed over to a relatively unknown studio named Sparky Pants, who would take over the project until it stopped active development near the end of 2019 while also creating an entire new client. There's a lot of speculation on why this was, but I don't have the full picture, and I don't think there's a lot of people who actually do, so I'm not going to spend time here speculating. But still, this was a confusing move to a lot of people. Direwolf was well respected by the community, and considering how strong the core of the game was, it felt weird to move on to new people. From a business perspective, it was perhaps even stranger. Tesla was certainly not a dead game, thanks in part to a lot of mobile users, but from the outside, it didn't seem to be a particularly successful one either. I have a much different perspective on this situation now than I did at the time. I still blame Bethesda for a lot of things regarding Tesla failing to find success. The number one issue was the marketing, which was nearly non-existent until it was far too late to find any sort of momentum. After its announcement, they sort of just let people slowly forget it existed, doomed to some corner of their mind and only popping up when Bethesda would post expansion trailers on their YouTube channel that would inevitably be mass downvoted by people who just wanted news on Elder Scrolls 6. There was also the crucial mistake of pushing out the revamped client from Sparky Pants way too early. I actually reached out to Sparky Pants with a few questions about the Switch, and they were able to shed some light on the restrictions they were under, which I'll put on screen. The end result of these restrictions was a client that was incredibly buggy, slow, and had some unprofessional mistakes, like for whatever reason not having access to the original voice lines and seemingly having to record placeholders as an emergency.
I have many important things on my mind.
Holy crap, that's so fucking bad. That is so bad. There's more info about this Switch and how they approached card design once the new client was settled in a short interview I did with them that I'll link in the description. And it's worth noting that after a few patches, the Sparky Pants client was better than the Direwolf one ever was. And look, whatever the reasons were behind the forced deadline for the client switch and lack of advertising, those two things were still major contributors to the game's continuous player hemorrhage. But still, when I look at it from the perspective of a business, I have no idea why the game didn't just shut down when Direwolf left. Sparky Pants did an admirable job with the game, with a solid release cadence and bringing over a lead card designer from Direwolf to keep the standard of set design, but no one would have been surprised if it had ended there without getting another shot at life. It was a game that wasn't all that successful or popular, and circumstances forced them to not only hire an entire new development studio, but invest in making an entire new client for the game. There's no way this was the right decision financially, and it resulting in another year and a half of active development for a game that I loved so much is something that I probably took for granted at the time. There were decision makers at Bethesda who cared, probably not enough of them, but just enough to keep the train on the tracks for longer than it should have been. One of those people was Pete Hines. Regardless of the entirely fair criticism a lot of people have for him from how he's handled other games, he definitely gave a shit here. A vice president for a company that would be bought for $7.5 billion would do weekly streams on Bethesda's Twitch channel where he would play the game for a couple hundred people, most of whom had no idea the game even existed and who would forget about it immediately afterwards. I've talked to him a few times at various events, and I always got the sense that he just loved the idea of having a card game like Magic in Bethesda's portfolio and pushed to make it work. One thing that might be conspicuous by its absence in this video so far is the lack of mention for a somewhat growing movement against games being permanently shut down. This is led by Ross of Accursed Farms, and I agree wholeheartedly with basically everything he's put forward in regards to this stuff. It's a movement both to preserve games and fix broken practices where things are sold as products but treated as services. And while I personally hold both of those to be in equal importance, it's also worth noting that practically the latter is the one that's far more likely to be fixed. Ubisoft taking down servers for games that had boxed copies sold in stores is something that should be illegal, but that doesn't really apply here. This is a free-to-play PvP card game. It's tough to make any argument that it wasn't sold as a service. I think Bethesda should at the very least release a database of the cards, and ideally in the future all games permanently shut down should have to release the source code or provide some realistic way to replicate the servers. But this video isn't about that. I'm not here to thank a massive corporation for not shutting a game down sooner, or for hiring new developers. For a company that big, whatever money Tesla lost could probably best be described as a rounding error. I'm just saying I don't have anger about their mistakes. Sometimes good games don't catch on. They did a lot of things to try and fix it, but it just didn't catch on. It happens.
So it's something that Tesla's given to me that really can't be replaced, just like a kickstart on Twitch and YouTube and stuff as well, and the casting. So Tesla always will have a special place in my heart. No matter what, the community, the fact that I still talk to so many people from the community today is, you don't really find that very often. It's really hard to find, especially in big communities.
It was unlike anything that's happened to me before or since, and a lot of people who deserve a lot of credit for that. People who at times I was probably not the best to, people who at times were probably not the best to me. We all kind of went through this weird pseudo Z-list fame together, and I personally am a lot better off because of the things that I learned, because, while I was going through it, it wasn't always enjoyable at the time, but wouldn't trade it for anything, and I'm glad I did it.
Like I said at the start, it's sort of impossible to make this video without getting personal. My time with Tesla lasted for around 3 years. I had personal problems during that time, like I'm sure everyone did. It'd be kind of weird if you went 3 years without having any. I don't want to phrase it like the game got me through those times. It wasn't a distraction from my problems. It was something productive, something fulfilling, something worth spending my time on. I want to genuinely thank the developers at Direwolf and Sparky Pants for making a great game and then supporting it for as long as they could. I want to thank whatever people at Bethesda cared about the game, including the community manager CVH, who became an undeserving punching bag for a lot of community frustration. And I want to thank the community for being good people who made it worth the time I put in. Those good people made Elder Scrolls Legends the best game I've ever played.
I'm just gonna barter.
I got the journey! Oh my god!
My fight is done.
planned! This was all planned! I knew this would happen! Easy!
Alright, we're swinging into this because we're getting Char's breeding pit. Holy
Alright, let's give it a go. I don't know what triggers first. Hopefully it gets an item.
Oh my god!
Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank the people who took time to do interviews with me, including the people at Sparky Pants. Their full interview is in the description. A few of the people featured in this video still make content. Their channels will also be linked in the description. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and checking out my work on Noisy Pixel. There should be a video on Yakuza Infinite Wealth coming out on that channel on the same day as this. The next video on this channel will be out sometime this month and will be a far less somber video on Trails Through Daybreak 2. Have a great rest of your day.